Welcome to the Writing Westward podcast. I'm your host, Brenden Rensink. Today we talk with Manu Karuka about his new book, Empire's Tracks: Indigenous Nations, Chinese Workers, and the Transcontinental Railroad. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. Each episode features a conversation with an author or scholar of new works that explore the North American West. We hope that our discussions will spark your curiosity to learn more and think differently about the North American West as a region and its peoples, environments, histories, literature, and so forth. You can follow Writing Westward on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or on Twitter at Writing West. You can listen on our website, writingwestward.org, or subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. We're listed on most major distributors. To learn more about the Redd Center, our programming, live-streamed lectures, funding opportunities for research and events, or anything else, find us at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's reddcenter.byu.edu. You can get more regular updates about the Redd Center on Facebook and Twitter as well. Manu Karuka is Assistant Professor of American Studies and affiliated faculty with Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Barnard College. His new book, Empire's Tracks: Indigenous Nations, Chinese Workers, and the Transcontinental Railroad, was published by the University of California Press in 2019 in their American Crossroads series. Empire's Tracks takes some familiar histories of American westward expansion and transcontinental railroad construction and retells them through the often missing contexts of capitalism, finance, and what Karuka terms a military finance nexus. Viewed as continental imperialism, Karuka shows how the enterprises of expansion, military conquest, and capitalist enterprise were intertwined and concurrent, and that their continental extension unfolded over colonized territories, not American homelands. By featuring histories of how native peoples and Chinese laborers experienced the Transcontinental Railroad story, Empire's Tracks expands our view of history. Integrations of global economic networks, political and economic philosophy, and some post-colonial literature and theory offer a powerful set of lenses through which to read old stories anew. Professor Manu Karuka, thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about your book. I was happy to spend quite a bit of time with it.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
I have kind of an outline of questions I want to go through, and I think if we can work through all of them, we'll hit most of the large points of your book. From my reading, it seemed that part of your approach was taking a very familiar narrative of the construction of the transcontinental railroads and trying to reorient how we talk about them, the stories we tell in order to tell the story of transcontinental railroads, and in many ways place in some correctives of some of the familiar narratives and familiar stories. And one of the most striking is taking the story of transcontinental railroad construction and turning it into a story about continental imperialism, which is a very different lens through which to view these same stories. And I'm curious how you came to this approach.
Yeah, so I think I came to this project not through an interest in railroads, actually, but through an interest in thinking about imperialism and colonialism. I'd studied, as a student in college, I'd studied the historiography of British imperialism in South Asia. So the ways historians have understood that era and the power relations at play and the ways that you interpret documents and what you can learn from those documents. So all of this was very interesting to me. And when I began graduate school, I was wanting to apply some of those insights or think about some of those insights in relation to North America and to the place where relation to the place where I live. And so that's what initially led me to this framework and to these questions about, thinking about familiar stories, as you said, familiar narratives, but trying to approach them from different lights, from different angles. Another aspect that really drove the book for me is a commitment to the idea, the principle of national liberation. I came out of ethnic studies, and ethnic studies itself historically had its formative moment in 1968. The way it's remembered is the Third World Student Strike in San Francisco State and UC Berkeley. And these undergraduate students named themselves as third world students. This was in the era of the movement against the Vietnam War in the United States. And they drew clear connections between the experiences in their working class communities of color in California and beyond, and the experiences, the demands, the impulses driving decolonization movements in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia. And so, I've been studying this history and I've been studying this field for a long time. And so I also brought that with me to the project and to the questions I wanted to ask about the Transcontinental Railroad.
Are there other topics, so you had made a decision that you wanted to study something in North America and kind of bringing your previous interest and expertise in British India and ethnic studies. Were there other similar topics that you flirted with or thought that you might apply these approaches to?
Yeah, actually. So when I began graduate school, I thought I was planning to write a dissertation on indentured labor migrations from colonial India to British sugar colonies in the aftermath of the abolition of slavery.
Sugar colonies where?
In Guyana, in Trinidad, and in Fiji. So in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. There's a through line in Empire's tracks about gender and the relationship between, let's say, gendered relations and imperialism. And so this was also a through line for me in that earlier project that I was thinking about on indentured labor migrations, thinking about gender in a system of migration that was actually managed by the British imperial state and the different colonies that were sending and receiving these workers. And there were questions of race and race at play, race and class and gender. So some of this, there's a bundle of questions, concerns that I think are also in Empire's tracks that I was thinking about in that other context. But I switched over to this project.
All the things we think we're going to do when we go to grad school.
Yeah. And, well, there's a story. There's a story behind this. I started graduate school in 2001, and I was at NYU, and the maybe third week of graduate school, I was commuting from my parents' house in New Jersey, and maybe the third week, I think 9/11 happened. And so I was, living in the place, in the communities that I'd grown up in, and going to school and, studying the field, American studies, and thinking about a project. And also at the time riding trains from my parents' house to New York and experiencing, things on the train, going back, especially late at night. There were a few times when the train would just stop in the middle of nowhere and stop for a long time. They shut down the power and there was no announcement. And on these trains, there's a lot of immigrants, a lot of South Asian people, a lot of Arab people going home from work, whether it's, Wall Street work or whether it's work in restaurants or in stores. So a whole mix of people, a whole range of people on these trains. And this is around this time when we were hearing stories of people's relatives disappearing, and eventually what we came to understand is this whole process system of detention that had been put in place almost immediately. And so these were things I was living through and experiencing. And it felt to me in that moment that, I was compelled to shift my focus from the sugar colonies and the kinds of questions that would open up to some other site. And the railroad actually, early on became a site where I felt like, there's a lot here for me to learn. There's a lot here for me to think about that seem somehow connected to the things that I'm observing as I move through the world.
Yeah. I mean, now that we hear kind of the background, it has me thinking about lots of global connections, and there's a lot of kind of broader global histories this connects to. That's fascinating. Although I think that your other project may have made for some better destination vacations to visit archives. I'm thinking about Fiji and Trinidad. It may have been better archival trips than Wyoming.
Well, I like Omaha a lot, but yes, you're right.
Well, let's kind of start down the list of some of these these ideas, and maybe we'll start with kind of the land and the geography of Transcontinental Railroad expansion and American expansion, kind of that geography itself. The United States, as part of one of its many creation myths or creation stories, as we talk about continental expansion and this idea of manifest destiny and how it was just written in the stars that the United States was going to expand across the country. And one of the outcomes of that discourse over the last, 100, 150 years is that there starts to be an implied, just kind of foundational understanding that this is American land, that this is inherently America from coast to coast. And part of what your book does is flip that on its head and to stop talking about a continental United States and to start talking about these regions as colonized territory, colonized land. Could you walk us through a little bit of that kind of flip in perspective?
Yeah. So I think the railroads are, they're a core infrastructure of this process that I'm calling continental imperialism, and where we see foreign land, foreign territory that's occupied by corporations and by the U.S. Army, by railroad corporations and by the U.S. Army working together, occupied in order to impose property relations, landed property relations, and impose forms of production. In these sites here, it's ultimately it ends up being large-scale agriculture and ranching. But as I said, the railroads are a core infrastructure of this. And one of the ways we can see this is through the land grants that U.S. Congress made to the railroad companies. And when I talk about this, I show a slide, and there's many maps that if anyone's listening, there's many maps you can find where you can find railroad land grants by Congress in North America or in the continental United States to railroad companies. And you can see it's millions of acres of land that was granted.
Some listeners may not know, but part of the way that the railroads funded the enterprise was that the U.S. government gave them. In some places, it was kind of an alternating checkerboard of plots 20 miles out from the railroad. Other places in the Northwest, it was just, instead of that, they just took enormous timber reserves. But the idea being that on the back end of railroad construction, the railroads could then sell this land or sell the lumber and pay off the debts they had accrued. But yeah, so some of the maps are really mind-boggling. The amount of
they're incredible.
The swaths of land that were granted out.
Yeah. And so what you just said, there's a piece to that I think is really significant, that I'd like to come back to, which is the financial aspect of this.
Oh yeah. We will get to that. Yeah.
Okay. These maps, I agree, they're mind-boggling. And when you see what many of us just think of habitually as the continental United States, or the homeland, if you think of the language of, for example, Homeland Security. And you see, when you look at these maps and you think about them in historical context, it's incredible to think that most of this land was granted by Congress in abrogation of treaties with Indigenous Nations. So most of this land was actually not, there were no large settlements, towns, or no cities, really. There was no production happening. When you talk about lumber industry or mining industries, all of these, really developed in the wake or in relationship with the construction of these railroads. And so to see, in a way, so Congress is granting land that the U.S. government, federal government doesn't fully control, that citizens of the U.S. are not inhabiting. It's granting this land, which is in foreign country, to these railroad corporations. And the railroad corporations they raise the money, they build the tracks, they build the rails through this land, and they kind of materialize that claim on the land through the process of the railroad construction and maintaining these lines once they're built. And so there's a relationship between the state and the corporation here in kind of settling the continent, in claiming this territory.
Well, sometimes we have this picture, right, of like, the intrepid explorer, out there planting the flag or military conquest, but you're telling a story of continental conquest, but through industry. And that is what really, I think the word used was materialized, kind of
Yes.
on the ground, American claims.
Yeah.
Which seems like is this an uncomfortable idea, do you think, for many Americans? Less romantic, less easy to, to wax romantic about, that it's about capitalist enterprise and industry?
Yeah, I mean, so Frederick Jackson Turner has this historian proposed this idea of the frontier thesis. And when we talk about a national mythology, that's deeply etched in the sense of what the country is. I taught for a few years in West Texas, and students would come. This was at a state university there, Texas Tech University, and students in my classes would come to me after class and say, my grandparents were the first white people who lived, the first generation of white people who lived in their small town, and we'd be studying indigenous history, Comanche history, let's say, and it gave them a very different, as you say, it punctured some of the romanticism, maybe, of family stories that they heard, which were deeply intertwined with their own senses of self and the communities that they came from. And it punctured that in some ways, but I hope in useful and productive ways, where they came to understand actually the land itself, where they had grown up, the lands that they considered home, and they came to understand the history of those lands in a fuller way. So yeah, I think, maybe we lose some of that romanticism that we've attached to these ideas of the pioneer. But then I think we also gain a clearer understanding of the place, of the land. And I think in many ways it's incredible the ways, for me, even to this day, I've been studying this for so long, and it still seems so fresh. It speaks to our moment in so many ways. And so maybe what we lose, perhaps we gain some things as well, understanding contemporary struggles over infrastructure and the relationship between industry and entrepreneurship and large-scale suffering or large geographies of suffering. So this week, for example, there are the terrible fires that are flaring through California, and part of the story with what's going on with those fires is corporate malfeasance. It's not just a question of climate change. It's also decades, even in some cases, from what I understand, wires and electrical infrastructure that should have been replaced a century ago, and it's now just unable to continue functioning, to continue operating. So there are connections, I think, and I think maybe puncturing some of that mythology, the romanticism, can give us a more accurate understanding of where we're living, and by where we live, I mean the actual places, the land itself, and what some of the questions, helping us to come up with the questions we need to ask each other collectively together in order to think about how we can continue living or live better on these lands.
Yeah, because that's what we're about. We're about asking difficult questions about the past so that we can understand it better, but so that we can then learn how to ask difficult questions about the present. At least that's what motivates me. That's why I'm in the profession. How do you view your role, or what strategies do you use then to get the general public to buy into this? Because asking difficult questions about the past or present is uncomfortable. It is sometimes not rewarding. Sometimes it feels more destructive than constructive. I think over the long term of our careers so far, we can see the long-term benefits of going through these difficult processes of inquiry, but sometimes the public doesn't. How do you approach that? How do you take this and get the public to see the value in it, or get them to kind of walk through it themselves?
Part of it is writing. I think a lot, and I work a lot on writing, trying to write more clearly. And trying to write in a way that I hope is compelling, not at all condescending. I think the ideas are difficult. They're complicated sets of histories and ideas that I'm trying to work with. But I'm hoping to communicate them, to bring them across in a way that really lives and speaks not just historically, but speaks to us now. But there's something about, this isn't just about, willfully going back and cherry picking in order to find versions of history that will satisfy, kind of capricious desires of the present moment. I think there's also something about really working hard to find what actually happened and to understand, the past in order to understand better how we got to the present. So one example for this, for me, is in the archival work for the book. There's a whole series of conversations that were taking place between people who were running the railroad corporation, so overseeing construction, the chief engineers of the Union Pacific Railroad, let's say. And then on the other side, they were having this dialogue with generals back in Washington, D.C., and then also in the plains. And both sides were talking to each other about resources from the railroad itself, where the railroad would be building, if the railroad would be available to move troops or war material in certain seasons, and where the railroad would plan to build so that the Army could plan its forts, its fortifications. And on the flip side, requests from corporate leaders, construction leaders, asking for military details to provide security for surveying parties, or to provide security for work parties, or even to not security necessarily, but even to just provide rifles and ammunition for working parties in certain areas. And this is a give and take that was going on week by week, month by month, and they were planning together. And in the histories, when you go to let's say you go to the library, and the way the histories are set up, there's one part of the library, one shelf, or one series of shelves where you'll find the North American Indian histories. There's another series of shelves where you'll find the military histories. And there's a whole other series of shelves where you'll find the corporation histories. And if you look at these books, they tend to read one half of the conversation, one side of the archive. So I think it's actually, trying to understand the history in a more accurate sense. Mm. Also, it's not just being led by by the questions of the moment, but trying to understand this history more accurately. That leads us to, let's say, read both these sets of archives together and trace out this dialogue that's going on and find meaning, understand something from that dialogue, from the give and take between corporate leaders and military leaders.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, often it's presented as a story of the military went out first and subdued the land and the peoples, and then industry and settlement came later, kind of as a multi-stage process. I think I'm thinking about some of the paintings. Westward, the Course of Empire. That painting doesn't have railroads in it, I don't think. But some of the other ones that I'm trying to remember the name of one. Is it like American Progress, where there's kind of Lady Liberty floating across the land, and there's some military out front, some buffalo and native peoples running, and then behind her is the telegraph and the railroad, right?
Yes.
But that needs to be collapsed, or that's concurrent happening. So you think you came to that by just trying to understand history on history's terms, and you found a very different story that we just simply haven't articulated correctly.
Yes, some of it was just, spending time in archives and reading outside of the box that I initially came there for, and seeing what I could find. Some of it is reading across these different subfields of history and seeing, these military historians are writing about this one episode that appears in all these railroad histories, but
it's the same episode.
Saying something same episode, but they're saying something very different about it. So, part of it was reading the histories that people have written. Part of it was through the archive. And so, the question you started with about the continental United States, understanding this as not through a framework of westward expansion, but understanding it through a framework of continental imperialism, I think it's an insight that came to me from doing this research and from studying the history and from trying to understand the patterns, why things happened when they did, why companies were organized the way they were, why the military had these particular relationships with the corporations, the introduction of new military technologies at specific moments, why railroads were built in particular places and how that pattern changed over time. So trying to think about these patterns, and, based on what I was learning from the histories that have been written, based on what I was learning from the archives, that's what led me to these insights about ideas like continental imperialism.
In the book, you use the phrase, the war finance nexus. Is this something different than kind of the military industrial complex that we talk about today?
Yes, I think so. So this comes from trying to be precise about imperialism, which is a core category for me in the book. And I want to be, precise about it. Everyone's against imperialism. But if you ask them what they're against, they may give you many different definitions. What exactly they're speaking against. I shouldn't say everybody. Most people are against imperialism. But in the fields that I work in U.S., let's say the history of the American West, U.S. 19th century history, American studies, where I teach, imperialism is often now thought of in really subtle ways, complex ways, as a form of cultural domination, or as a cultural phenomenon, or it's understood as a form of ideological domination, or analyzed in the realm of ideology, or purely political domination, geopolitics. But I wanted to think about imperialism, drawing on the work of Lenin and W.B. Du Bois, understanding imperialism as the nature of capitalism in certain historical moments. And the ways that both of them write about it is linking war and finance. And so that's where I come to this idea of the war-finance nexus. The military-industrial complex is, that's a concept that Eisenhower first introduced after the Second World War. And this has to do, again, I think if we understand the moment when it was named and understand historically what was happening, it has to do with the nature of the U.S. economy after the war and, very stern warnings that Eisenhower was giving that went unheeded by political leaders afterwards, but, warnings about imbalances that would open up in the U.S. economy and in the world economy if the U.S. was to follow to follow the path it was on. The war finance nexus for me is I think we can relate it to Eisenhower's warnings about the military-industrial complex, but it's broader than that, and it precedes that, of course. I'm writing about, the period following the U.S. Civil War. And so the war finance nexus is really to see, in the case of the railroad, it's partly what I was describing to you before, this dialogue that's going on. There is this nexus, this combination of the let's say the forces of military occupation over indigenous lands and the financialization, the expropriation of those lands in a rapidly developing financial economy through institutions based in New York. And so for me, this is the war finance nexus is a phrase that I come back to throughout the book, and it's partly a writing strategy, to get back to that earlier question you asked about communicating these ideas. And so it's a phrase that I come back to throughout the book in order to remind the reader that when I'm talking about imperialism, I'm really, my focus here is really drawing our attention to where war meets finance and manifests in these ways.
Well, let's move to some of your discussion of different native peoples. You have chapters on Lakotas, Pawnees, and Cheyennes. I thought maybe we could take a few moments on each, and maybe you could share some of the key insights, because you use them to tell different stories, because they do have different experiences as they're interacting and interfacing with this war finance nexus. So why don't we start with the Lakotas? What's the key takeaway from their experience in this?
Yeah, so I think for me, this is the different histories is a really important part of what I'm trying to communicate with this book as well. And so the traditional ways, let's say, thinking about the history of the Transcontinental Railroad is a single history. And just as the traditional way, let's maybe of thinking about the history of North America is a single history, we could call that Westward expansion or manifest destiny. Or the traditional way of thinking about the history of U.S. capitalism, again, is often it's a single history. So I'm wanting to disrupt that by providing senses of multiple histories that develop out of the experiences, the ongoing experiences, historical developments of different indigenous communities, and then also of Chinese workers. So the chapter on Lakotas really focuses on distinction between what I think of as Lakota ways of expansive ways of relating to the lands where they live, their homelands, these wide open spaces of the plains. And the way I think about it, this expansiveness, which is both the forms of relationships, the types of relationships, the relations between different communities, the relations between Lakotas and neighboring communities. There's a sense of expansiveness of moving over the land, and there's a relationship between the land itself and the other forms of life on the land. So in the beginning of the chapter, I trace out Lakota movements in relation to buffalo and the buffalo herd, and the ways the buffalo move following grass over the cycle of the seasons, where there's frost, and moving to areas where grass is available, moving to find water over the cycle of seasons, or as the weather changes, and Lakotas following the buffalo, and this kind of being the concrete, manifestation of the relationship with the land. So this expansiveness that I contrast to the expansionist drive of the United States. And so I want to counterpose expansiveness with expansion. And we can think of expansion as economic expansion, the term growth that we're all familiar with, westward expansion, the expansion of the U.S. Jurisdiction, U.S. territorial control. So expansion in these different ways. And I want to think about a distinction between expansiveness and expansion, that expansiveness has room for other ways of living on that land. And expansion doesn't. Expansion is about kind of moving over and subsuming. It's a form of domination. So what I track out, where I end the chapter is the Fort Laramie Treaty, the Treaty of 1868. And I'm reading at the end of the chapter some oral histories, Lakota oral histories of the treaty.
Yeah, and how they view the treaty terms, yeah.
How they remember, the terms of the treaty, the meaning of the treaty, the discussion of the treaty. This is from a collection that Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz edited back in the 70s. And there's some incredible ideas in these oral histories that what Lakotas remember in the treaty was that there was space, one side of the tracks would be Lakota land, and Lakotas would have control and autonomy to govern that land, and the other side of the tracks would be the United States to govern that side of the tracks in this way. So even encoded in this historical memory of that treaty, which is the last treaty the Lakota signed with the U.S., it embeds this idea of what I think of as expansiveness, as compared to these expansionist ideas. Let's say that the U.S. came in and defeated, militarily subjugated the Lakotas.
It almost sounds, I mean, I don't want to kind of fall into this trope, but sometimes we talk about Native peoples and we talk about cyclical ways of thinking and cyclical worldviews versus, kind of Western European linear thought, linear ways of thinking and knowledge. But I think it kind of appropriately fits in that, this idea of expansiveness versus expansionist. One, it does seem more cyclical and one is much more linear.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it as cyclical. That's really interesting.
You talk about kind of like by seasons going, using the land and migrating and, but not necessarily doing things in cycles, but doing things in just a less linear way.
Yeah. I mean, one way I think of it is if I could just briefly, is it's a way of the expansiveness, actually, I think, and this maybe relates to the idea of the cycles, is it actually emerges in relationship to the particularities of that place. And this is something I felt when I lived on the South Plains. The way let's say American life is situated on the South Plains could be the way American life is organized in California or in New Jersey. But the South Plains is a very different place. The place itself is very different than those other places. And yeah, so there's an attentiveness to the place that I want to bring out. There's a very material attentiveness to the place.
You have to live in relationship to and in reaction to an actual place. Whereas, I mean, and again, not to go back to these paintings, I sometimes when I'm doing intros to Western history, we show these paintings that show these rugged mountain landscapes in the plains, and then just a clear, straight line of the railroad just cut straight through whatever landscape it is, right? The railroad just cuts straight through in complete disregard for the actual geography and, ecology of the land, right? The railroad doesn't live in that place. It doesn't live in reaction to that place. It cuts through it. Or that's how the paintings present it.
Yeah.
Well, let's move to the Pawnee. What about the Pawnee Experience? How do you use that story to diversify our understanding of these railroad stories?
So the Pawnee history of the railroad is remembered differently than the Lakota and Cheyenne history, where Pawnees, there were groups of men who worked as scouts for the U.S. Army. And, that was my entry point in thinking about this. Okay, this is obviously a very different relationship.
Did you find these Pawnee scouts as you were working through some of those archives and you thought, oh, here's a native story I haven't thought about before?
It was something I was, all of these stories are written in, anyone who's been reading Transcontinental Railroad histories will know all these communities are written about. So I didn't dig deep. In fact, part of what I wanted to do is look at the railroad itself, but also what seem to be these familiar stories that are told in episodic form that are kind of jumbled into this larger, single, clear, overarching narrative, and try to piece them apart. Piece apart these episodes or piece apart these different communities.
Pause and actually take some time with them.
Take some time with them, and then also understand, well, what did the railroad mean from the perspective of Pawnee history? Because we've understood, we've been told a lot about what we think the railroad means, what we should think the railroad means from the perspective of American history, let's say, but from the perspective of Pawnee history. So with Pawnees, there's a story here that I think is actually not centrally about the scouts, about the men. I think there's a story that's centrally about the work and the relationships of Pawnee women. So some of the first missionaries who went to Pawnee country from New England would send back letters about in their perspective, the degradation of Pawnee women, just the horrible overwork that they had to do. One missionary, I think, compared them to enslaved people and said that, they work harder than slaves. They're treated worse than slaves by their male relatives. This very crazy over the top kind of reporting. And there's a lot that's really interesting about those reports. One is that these missionaries were living in villages, which were areas where Pawnee women did a lot of the work, farming and other kinds of work. And there's few reports of missionaries out on hunts, which is where men were doing much more of the work of hunting and leading communities, villages around. And so there's a gender imbalance in what they're seeing, but they're reporting this, from their perspective, this degradation that's part of what they're seeing as the distance of Pawnees from the Christian values that they're trying to bring. So that's kind of some of these initial records. And then some of the earliest treaties that the Pawnees sign with the United States are treaties of defense and treaties of protection that the U.S. promises to Pawnees. And as part of this defense and protection, they're promising that that the U.S. will disperse funds to introduce farming and to teach Pawnee people how to farm. And so they hire farmers from the United States, agency farmers who are paid through these through these annuities and given land on the Pawnee reserves that's set aside for them to farm, ostensibly to teach Pawnees how to farm. And when they say teach Pawnees how to farm, they mean teach Pawnee men how to farm, because Pawnee women had been farming their lands for generations. Yeah. And so there are these treaties of defense that they will be defending Pawnees from attacks from other communities, Lakotas, Cheyennes, other communities, or from settlers. And then they'll be providing, education in farming, and then also that they would be providing schools for Pawnee children. And so Pawnee women were the ones who were, kind of at the heart of overseeing this agricultural production traditionally. And Pawnee grandmothers were, the ones who really raised their grandchildren. And so taught them, all the knowledge that they needed to live on the land, how to grow food, how to be in relation with others, ethics, morality, all of this. And so these schools were boarding schools that were kind of on the outskirts of these reserve communities. And year by year, the teachers at the school would write about their difficulty in keeping children at the school. And they were asking for authorization to essentially kidnap the children, hold them hostage over the course of the year. And this is happening alongside just incredibly shocking mortality rates for the children. So there's one year, I think there were the lead teacher wrote a letter back east, writing something like, this has been a very healthful year, bountiful year for the school. We've only lost 3 or 4 children this year. So that was a great year. So they're trying to impose education that is taking the children away from their grandmothers. They're trying to impose commercial agriculture that's taking land and seeds and crops and work away from women. And what's interesting is that they fail. The U.S. fails. And they're trying to impose this in really violent ways, as I write about in the chapter, extremely violently. But they fail. So this starts in the 1830s. But by the 1860s, Pawnee women are farming 5 times the acreage of these agency farmers. To me, that's really incredible. Yeah. That they are able to sustain that. In fact, not just sustain it, but they actually expanded the land that they grew. They were growing more food, more acres in the 1860s than they had been in the 1830s. And so I want to understand this history of the Scouts, which, that's my entry point into this, was reading these railroad histories, and you get these colorful stories about Pawnee Scouts. And, there's one story which I didn't write about in the book, but it appears in a lot of railroad histories about Scouts who came in and scared a bunch of politicians and corporate officials who had come from the East and were on a tour. And they came in and acted as if they were raiding the camp, and it was all in good fun. That was put on by the it was a show, essentially, that was put on by the local construction officials. So you get these stories about Pawnees, but you don't really understand, where did these men come from? What was happening in their community in the decades leading up to this railroad? And how might they have understood the decision to work for the railroad? What sense did this make in the terms of their own history? So I wanted to situate that in terms of those relationships.
If that story or other ones of scouts are the only samples we have of Pawnee Experience, it doesn't just it flattens the Pawnee Experience in the world, but it's quite a shallow and narrow view. What about the Cheyenne Experience? What story do you tell there?
So with Cheyennes, it's a story of trade. So Cheyennes had moved down into the plains, responding to the intensification of colonial violence to the east in the lands where they had been living, moved down into the plains, and they were a relatively small nation compared to other nations, Lakotas and some of the village nations. But they were able to find, prosperity on the plains by situating themselves geographically in such a way that they were conduits for an intertribal trade. And not just intertribal trade, but also trade to the south with Mexico. Mm-hmm. And so different Pawnee communities in different areas would specialize in different parts of this trade, horses or beaver or buffalo. And this really was the core of Cheyenne prosperity. And the railroad, the meaning of the railroad that I understand for Cheyennes is really breaking apart this intertribal trade. The line comes through and breaks apart the ability to move. There's an assertion with Colorado territory, an assertion of restrictions on Cheyenne movements over their lands. And this was a really, really violent assertions, including the Sand Creek Massacre, which is one of the most notorious massacres in this period of U.S. history. And, the end game from the perspective of Cheyennes, the end game of the railroad is isolation. It's, the partition of Cheyenne lands, even of the nation itself, into southern and northern branches. And the isolation from this rich intertribal trade, which is not just trade, but also, cultural and political life. And, it's this profound isolation. And this really undercuts the story that's told of U.S. railroads, but also railroads in other colonial contexts. Let's say what I would think of as more apologist versions of these histories, which present them as providing forms of connection, routes of connection, establishing trade where it's presumed trade didn't exist before, developing, this new international trade, connecting communities that have been parochially limited or provincially kind of isolated before. And with Cheyenne history, what we see is the opposite. You have a community that had already been linked really to an international trade, trading, let's say, beads that had come from very specific workshops in Venice, glass beads. So this is an international trade, a global trade. And through the construction of the railroad, being cut off from that international trade and being isolated through military invasion, through military occupation, being isolated and, being partitioned, and then, being rendered dependent in this way.
So it's an inverse than the normal story of connection and integration.
Yeah, it's an inverse of that story of integration. I think where I end in this chapter and in the book is, if we want to see integration, true integration, and that's part of what is on the table if we think about decolonization.
We're quickly running out of time, and we haven't really touched much at all on Chinese labor, which is another big theme in the book, and the relationship between continental imperialism and capitalism being built by and at the sacrifice of Chinese bodies, literally. How do you bring in the Chinese stories and experiences to kind of deconstruct and help us retell these railroad histories?
Yeah, so once again, anyone who's read any transcontinental railroad histories knows that Chinese workers provided, they provided the labor for the western leg of that railroad. And it's actually, in Asian American history, it's one of the most iconic If we think of the history of Asians in North America, people from Asia, Chinese railroad labor would be one of the first images that comes to mind. So this is not a hidden history in any way. But in this chapter, I want to ask why did the railroad hire Chinese workers? What was it about Chinese workers in particular that made them an attractive workforce, a labor force to seek out? And I find several things. I find that, first of all, the turn to Chinese labor, I think we need to understand in relation to the incredible violence that occurred in California in relation to indigenous peoples in the years after the U.S. annexed California. And so violence both in labor law, so where indigenous peoples were, indentured out to large farms and large economic concerns, and also just violence, just vigilante violence against indigenous communities.
Yeah.
People would go in and organize what they called hunting parties and go in and just murder people where they could find them, burn down villages. And this violence, I think, is really the historical context to understand the arrival of Chinese people to this area and the attractiveness of them as a workforce. This violence had been organized. It was racial violence, and it had been organized already. And it's some of this violence then that gets turned against Chinese people in the gold fields, some of which I track out in this chapter. So there's a context of incredible colonial and racial violence. There's also the availability of Chinese workers. This is something that sets the Central Pacific Railroad, which is the western leg of the railroad, apart from the Union Pacific Railroad, which they're competing with, the eastern leg. That rather than trying to recruit workers in eastern North America and somehow bring them all the way across the continent, they can get workers from across the Pacific. And so this becomes a more easily facilitated supply of labor. Mm-hmm. There's something here, to me, when I first understood this, was an incredible way of just a corrective against the idea of manifest destiny, the idea of North America as the United States, that at this time when the railroad was being built, to bring workers from, let's say, New York or Hartford or Boston to California, you would have to either sail them down to Panama and then have them go across and then sail up the Pacific, or you'd have to sail them all the way down around, the continent. And that was very expensive. It was risky. It cost a lot. And by the time the workers arrived, many of them would just go off and do other work. So that just wasn't a feasible supply of labor for the Central Pacific Railroad. So there was in a really concrete way, California was overseas territory of the United States. And that's something that the railroad, transforms, but, in those kinds of ways. Shipping labor, shipping locomotives, shipping rails.
Yeah. And there's been a lot of great work recently kind of bringing California and the Pacific Northwest, kind of recasting it into a Pacific history and kind of this larger Pacific world that falls outside of that national narrative of American westward expansion, right?
Yes.
But and it kind of reintroduces not necessarily contingency, but when we start with the continental U.S. as our starting point or read backwards through history, we miss all of the very real important things that were going on that don't necessarily feed into that final outcome as clearly as we think, right?
Yeah, I agree.
So we read out the Pacific world because, until we get there, until, the 1890s when we, and beyond when we then extend our continental imperialism right across the ocean. But
that's right.
Before then we kind of disregard that world. But there's lots of really great, there's a lot of, actually, I have a growing list for the podcast to go farther west out into the Pacific as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of great work. I mean, one book that resonates really strongly with this chapter is Cornell Chang's book
Yes.
on Northwest
Pacific
Railroad
Connections.
labor. Pacific
Yeah.
Connections. It's a great book. And something he writes about that I write about too is the class formations, the relationships of Chinese merchants to Chinese workers and then to the railroad companies. And so this is also a distortion, I think, reading back and presuming that there was wanting to presume mutual aid, let's say the principle of mutual aid among Chinese communities in California. And I don't think that was the case in the case of railroad labor, at least.
I'm also looking forward, I don't know if you're familiar with Sean Fraga, who finished his degree at Princeton recently, but he has a book coming out with Yale called Ocean Fever. A lot about the Northwest, but kind of linking together steam power and industry, and this transcontinental story, but then extending it out into the Pacific. I'm really excited.
Looking forward to that. I'll be on a panel with him at
great.
the AHA this January. So.
I'll try to attend it.
Yeah, great.
We should probably wrap up. Do you have any last words about kind of where you're taking either this research or new research in the future?
Yeah, so I'm working on a book. The tentative title now is Against Imperialism. And it's taking this idea of the war finance nexus. And I want to think about core tactics of imperialism today and core anti-imperialist strategies today. So I'm just beginning that work now, and it's building on the historical insights that I learned from writing Empire's Tracks, and also trying to build on and extend some of the ideas as well, the conceptual idea, the concepts in the book as well. So I'm very excited about this book, and my heart is really in this project.
That sounds great. Thank you for the book. Thanks for your work, and thanks for spending a little bit of time with us today for the podcast.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate your work.
All right. Take care, Manu.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. You can find him at Micah, D-A-H-L, Anderson with an O.com. I'll include a link in the episode description. Besides subscribing to the podcast, you can receive regular updates about upcoming episodes by following on Facebook or Twitter. My name is Brenden Rensink, and I serve here as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, and pretty much everything else. So if you have any praise or critiques, you should probably just send them my way. I'm Associate Director of the Redd Center and an Associate Professor of History here at Brigham Young University. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions about the podcast, the Redd Center, our live-streamed lectures and events, funding opportunities, or anything else. If you have books you think I should consider for an episode, please send them my way. One last plug, I'm also the project manager and general editor of a great digital public history project hosted here at the Redd Center called Intermountain Histories. You can check it out by visiting www.intermountainhistories.org or download the free mobile app by searching Intermountain Histories on your Apple or Android devices. There you can read carefully curated histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. In any case, thanks again for listening to the episode. We'll see you next month.